Hello and welcome. I'm Lee Peterson, the host of the podcast WDcast, which is called WDcast because it's brought to you by WD Partners, whose tag is Innovation at Scale, which means that WD has services that range from strategy, design, digital, and operations to architecture and construction management. In other words, end-to-end services. That's WDpartners.com. Thank you, WD, for sponsoring this show, and thanks, Chris. The mission of this show, WDcast, is to talk to smart people from around the world about the burning platforms of the 21st century, not last century, although that has a lot to do with it, and the challenges involved. So we're not that concerned about what the platform is, as you're about to find out today, as long as it's on fire. And the one that we're going to talk about today is really on fire. So there's a lot to talk about. We've got a very special guest with us today. He is the author of the book called Young China. He also, stemming from that Young China, is in charge of a company called Young China, which is an insights firm. And he is a global speaker, including TED, which I would encourage you all to watch, and a sought-after consultant, and just kind of an all-around interesting story. His name is Zak Dychtwald. Hello, Zak. Thanks for joining us today. And how are you? And I have to ask immediately, kind of, where are you, too?
Hey, Lee, how's it going? Thank you for having me. Yeah, certainly exciting times. So I'm doing as best I can under the circumstances. I'm a bit of a virus refugee. I was meant to be in Wuhan, where, of course, where COVID-19, the artist formerly known as Coronavirus, formerly, where that explosion happened. So I was meant to be in Wuhan actually a day before quarantine hit. So I packed for a week-long sort of speaking trip, and that was 8 weeks ago. So I am calling from Brooklyn, New York, which I don't know. Time will tell how we fare here as this begins to spread. So
you are definitely a refugee, a COVID refugee, huh? Or coronavirus refugee.
Right. I was shooting something with Tencent. My book is about to come out in China, and the post-90s generation who I write about. So China does demography a little bit differently. Here we have millennials. China does typically by the decade, or when you're actually really talking hard market research, you have to split groups up between 3 and 5 years, just because the idea of a 20-person age grouping is sort of ridiculous in China. It moves too fast. So the post-90s generation, my generation in China, we're about to turn 30. And there's a Confucian saying, 30li. It means, this is a very loose translation, but more or less when you turn 30, you really got to have all your stuff together, all your shit together. And so Tencent was filming something about that. We were going to finish up the filming in Wuhan. Fortunately, I have someone who works at Young China Group in Wuhan who told me, look, put it off for a week. Let's see how things unfold. And we've all seen how things have unfolded. So lucky to be out.
Yeah, I'd say. Okay, and just a little disclaimer before we get going. The thoughts and opinions expressed today belong to the members of this discussion and do not necessarily represent those of the companies they work for. Zak, could you give us the story of your background, the journey? Like, how did you get to where you are today other than escaping the virus?
Yeah, happily. So I actually grew up just outside of Berkeley in California. Small town, more deers than people sort of deal. Went to school in New York. I went to Columbia, which was a big culture shock for me.
Yeah.
And I took actually one semester of Mandarin because my parents made me, my dad in particular, but hated it. I actually skipped class for 2 months. I did more work on that one class than all my other 4 combined, and thought I was going to drop, realized I couldn't. And it to this day is the worst grade I've ever gotten in my life. Finished after one semester, but because of that one semester, when it was time to study abroad, I had the option of going to Asia. So I was a big science fiction fan. And when I was looking at the pamphlets, France sort of looked like a history book. And Hong Kong looked like the cover of the science fiction books I like to read.
Yeah.
And it was just sort of on a lark that I decided to apply to Hong Kong. I got in. I was lucky enough to do that. And once I started traveling to mainland, particularly to Shenzhen, which is right across from
Yeah.
Hong Kong,
Mm-hmm.
I started to realize that the China that gets described to us, the China that gets described in the media, the China that sort of even reverberates off of professionals who have spent a week or two in Shanghai and come back China
Mm-hmm.
experts as it happens,
Yeah, yeah.
and it was far different than the China I was experiencing, the China I was seeing on the ground. And also a big element of that difference was simply like there was old stereotypes, there's old ideas of China that once you start to interact with young people on a substantive level, they just weren't playing out. And so 6 months later, I go back to New York, and everyone at Columbia is an artist until senior year, where we all become bankers and consultants. And I was in a consulting interview and was like, look, I don't want to do this.
Yeah.
And so I packed up my bags, and when I graduated, I moved to second tier city in China. I didn't know anybody. I didn't have a job. I was trying to get deep into the culture, and I didn't really have a plan.
You were trying to do this from the get-go.
For me, it was there's another element here, and this is something I don't normally talk about because it's a little bit self-indulgent, but to be totally candid, when I first went, if you had told me I'd write a book, I'd say get out of town. If you still told me I'd be there as long as I have been, no chance. For me, I was worried about being a sort of spoiled suburban Ivy League brat who didn't really know what he's made of. And so for me, going to China and being out on my own was as much about being there as being away from here, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So
and
a little bit
testing
of
my mettle a little bit.
I'm sorry, a little bit of into the wild.
A little bit, the nature of exploration these days is different.
Yeah.
And China was, there's not a lot of places on earth you can't go anymore, but China was the most linguistically and culturally distant place I'd ever been.
Yeah.
And the idea of cross-cultural psychology, immersing yourself in somewhere far away. You add to that the economic stakes that were beginning to be set up for China, as well as the fundamentally different government system and the way that is so consistently painted in the media. Mm-hmm. Trying to understand those things to me was just it was consistently the most exciting psychological proposition or sort of intellectual. It just got me going. It had my mind working overdrive all the time. And once you get that in your system, it's really hard for it to get out.
Yeah. And we talked about this beforehand, but my son lived there for, I think, about 3.5, 4 years. I was actually kind of surprised he came home, but he told me he actually liked it better there as a young person because he would actually talk to a couple people and say, hey, I could use some work. And they'd go, oh, why don't you go talk to this guy and that guy, and you'll have this job. And he would do that, and he would earn money for, however long he wanted to. And then he would go find another job, and it was just very kind of an open society in terms of that. I don't know if you had that kind of experience.
I mean, absolutely. Particularly, I moved there when I was 22, and that first year I was making about $800 a month, but it was enough. I was working at night, teaching English or SAT or ACT or sort of whatever I could get my hands on, basically to save up enough to then go buy a train ticket.
Uh-huh.
And that was my first year. When I first went to Chengdu, I ended up moving to Chengdu after my first year. I had met this young guy from Guizhou at which is inland China. It's one of the poorer provinces. Yeah. We met in the city called Chongqing. He was on the lower bunk of my hostel. The next day we hitchhiked to Chengdu just because we could, which is 3 hours on the back of a pig farmer's truck. We get to this hostel on the outskirts of town, and then it was rainy season. And because we were sort of stuck in this place, by the way, there's about 8 balsa wood bunks crammed into this one room. They're $3 a night. And then if you were a little bit tight on cash, you could wait for everyone to go to sleep and sleep on the couches in the maid room for $1 a night. So me and this guy, Juan, the guy I hitchhiked with, ended up doing that. And we just did that for 3 weeks just because we could. The fluidity, the level of sort of opportunity, particularly as a Westerner, if you want to get by and you have lower standards for what that looks like, there's a lot of excitement and adventure that feels available to you.
But how
particularly when you get out of first tier cities in China?
How was off the East Coast, right? And how was the language barrier especially once you got into the interior?
So language in China is very difficult. And one of the most difficult about language issues in China is that the way we study language is pretty fundamentally flawed. Language isn't math. The idea of just sitting in a classroom for a bunch of hours and learning language that way. I mean, any Chinese city, the highest the highest density population of bad Chinese speakers is your language classroom. And so if you're there from 9 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, just listening to bad Chinese all day, and then when you get out of class, you go and have beers with the other foreigners, it's one of the easiest ways to guarantee that your Chinese won't be that good after a couple of years. And so once you figure that out, like there are ways for self-study now, and yes, immersion, but also flashcards, and there's different flashcards. I mean, there's ways to do it now. You know, after 2 years, I passed the highest level that you could test for, or the highest level before you become an official translator. It's the HSK 6. And, you know, they say that takes 6 years, and I am far, far away from being any sort of, I'm actually quite bad at languages. Mm-hmm. But once you realize that the method, like the school method, might not be for you, you can pick it up. You can pick it up a lot quicker. One of the things I would say, though, is that it takes being very bad for a very long time, which I think we are not. A lot of us aren't okay with how bad you have to be. And making those mistakes at such a high volume, you know, you get through those mistakes to get good at Chinese. A lot of the people I see who fail at that aren't willing to be sort of bad as adults. They're not willing to sort of be embarrassed and not make those mistakes.
That's interesting. I had a similar experience. I ran stores in South Florida, and I learned how to speak Spanish there. I had taken like 8 years of Spanish in school, and you thought you knew a lot. But then, you know, like you're saying, having beers with people or going places with people where you're speaking nothing but that language, I learned fairly quickly. But they were also okay with not doing so well. You know, there's a lot of verbs and conjunctions, you know, that you're not doing that well with. And the thing that's difficult, I mean, as a comp to the two, is Spanish kind of looks like English. Like I can read it and I can say it, and I don't have that same issue with China. I mean, right. Chinese language looks so difficult.
Right.
It feels like it must have been a struggle. Or
it definitely is a struggle. It takes a lot of time. I still study every day. You know, there's tens of thousands of individual characters, and different than English, where we have a 26-letter alphabet that more or less describes our spoken language, right? Like the letters on a page are really just stand-ins for sounds that when you put them together, they just turn into a spoken language. Chinese is different.
Yeah.
You cannot read a character off the page if you do not recognize that individual character.
Wow.
Yeah.
I started off a presentation recently, and I had a couple of Chinese symbols, and it meant GungHo. And I learned that GungHo was adopted by the American Armed Forces when we worked with China against the Japanese in the 40s. And I was absolutely not sure that was the right thing. And I had somebody come up to me after the speaking thing, said, you know, I think you got that second symbol wrong.
Yeah, let me just say, when I hit the beach vacations and get to see everyone's exciting Chinese tattoos, it's I usually get some funny slip ups or
exciting
lazy tattoo artists. You know, that lasts forever, folks. In case you're thinking about getting one of those, feel free to text me first.
Hey, could you talk about, because this has always fascinated me, because in a sense it reminded me of what happened here a long time ago when we had the Vietnam War, et cetera. But could you talk about what happened in Hong Kong a little bit? I felt that was a really powerful thing, and some of the images coming back from that were amazing, you know, with umbrellas and gas masks and black outfits. I mean, it was really profound.
So you're referring, of course, to the most recent Hong Kong demonstrations.
Yes, sorry.
Student demonstrations for the most part, but we're talking about a million, at its height, 2 million people at the beginning peacefully protesting, which was an extradition bill. Mm-hmm. The extradition bill basically would have given Beijing and mainland China the ability to criminally charge people or charge people who are in Hong Kong in Chinese courts. That was just sort of the straw that broke the camel's back, though, because it became a much bigger demonstration, one that turned violent over the period of time, and one that also lasted. It was a bit of a war of attrition. It was remarkable to see. There's very few times in history that we've seen such a long-lasting, well coordinated, particularly at the beginning, and then kind of heart-wrenching. And also well documented, I would say. So to your point, like the quality of photos, the number of journalists, the number of stories that were streaming out were pretty incredible. I will say, so I know a lot of the people who were involved in those demonstrations, either a couple of people who were leading it, but also just a lot of people who were involved as Hong Kong citizens. I studied abroad in Hong Kong. The sort of alternative read to this, and this isn't as sexy as this was just a sort of just a democracy rally. You have to sort of understand the dynamics of Hong Kong over the last bunch of years. So in 1997, when Hong Kong legally went back to mainland China, passed from the UK to back to mainland China legally, and again, Hong Kong was never a democracy. And so in 1997, Hong Kong represented 20% of all of China's economy. 20%. It was known as the Pearl of the Orient. It was famously sort of the threshold separating China and Asia and the Western world, and thrived in that space. Now, this last year, Hong Kong represents less than 3% of the entire Chinese economy.
Wow.
There's been an incredible shift in terms of global relevance, in terms of economic relevance, as well as in terms of opportunity within Hong Kong. And so the way it's been described to me, I think most eloquently, is that young people in Hong Kong felt like there was a promise that was made to them when they were young, that you could get educated here, that you could afford an apartment here, that you could raise your kids here, that you could have a job here. And there's a feeling that promise has not been kept. Wealth inequality in Hong Kong is worse than it's been in the last 50 years.
Really?
50 years. The average rent in Hong Kong is 125% of the average income. This was one of the more irksome parts to me, is because it didn't look like a 99-1, the sort of rich poor dynamic. But ultimately, a lot of the issues that were bubbling to the surface, the sense of desperation that you see in young people, it actually happens all throughout, particularly Asian cities throughout the world, when the dynamics of cost of living, education opportunities, and work opportunities get so out of whack with so out of sync with what the average person can access. And who's to blame for that? The government. Who controls the government? Beijing. And so it became a young people and Hong Kong versus Beijing. But the dynamics of the city, and this is what is so sad for me, the dynamics of the city do not get fixed necessarily with democracy, particularly if housing, education opportunities, and work opportunities don't bring Hong Kong back to a stronger sort of economic standing where people can afford to live there.
Now, is that actually like from a broader perspective, sort of the same across the country, or is that exclusively a Hong Kong element?
So wealth inequality is worse in Hong Kong than it is in mainland China. But there's one crucial issue here that you just picked up on. So in New York, when the rent gets too high, and as it does, and in San Francisco, I'm from the Bay Area, so in San Francisco, the rent is ridiculous.
Yeah.
The great part about the rent being ridiculous in San Francisco is you could go to Denver, or you could go to Austin, or you go to Seattle, or you could go to Columbus, or you could leave and still feel like you're at home. The United States, particularly if you're American or if you become American, it feels like home.
Yeah.
Hong Kong, there's a big cultural divide between Hong Kong and mainland China. There just is. And so these young people in particular, they don't feel like they have anywhere else to go. There's no vent. There's no pressure valve that, I could go to Malaysia and feel like it's home. I could go to Singapore and feel like it's home. I could go to Shenzhen and it feels like it's home. Not quite. And so they're all of that pressure just gets continued to sort of, it compounds. And instead of being able to sort of vent and go to a less expensive place that still feels like theirs, there is no other place for people from Hong Kong that feels like home.
Well,
and that to me is a big crux is a major cornerstone of this issue that unfortunately doesn't really get discussed.
Oh, that's awful, because just the exact opposite is happening here. There's people coming from the coast to Columbus, Ohio,
Oh
to
yeah.
start businesses and buy homes. I was touring a guy through here, and he said, "How much is that home there?" It was a pretty big house, and I told him, and he goes, "I could buy 4 of those." You know, and he was from New York.
Good for that guy. No, it's true though. Like to me, this is one of the most vibrant parts of. I mean, this is what should happen. Like there's shit like that. These to me are sort of the levees in a healthy system, where that people are still moving to San Francisco and trying to start a business in San Francisco. To me, is lunacy. I mean, you take the same sort of startup fund. And in Columbus, it might last for a year with the number of employees. In San Francisco, it lasts for 3 months. Suddenly, you're out of business before you could get off the starting line. Like that to me, and in China, you're seeing that too. The push away from first-tier cities as they become too expensive, as property becomes out of reach for the average worker. Suddenly, these second and third-tier cities are becoming way more vibrant, as they should.
Yeah.
Hong Kong doesn't really have that option.
Well, Wuhan was like that, right? I mean, 11 million people, 11.5 million people.
Wuhan is a city I know decently well. There's somebody who works for me from there, and I have a number of friends there. I've been there a couple times. Great. They have a couple of really good 小吃. So 小吃 is like a type of snacks. It's like they have some good food. They have some like really quality food, and it's a cool place with a lot of great attitude. And you're exactly right. As Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen become too expensive, Wuhan is a major destination. Chengdu, Chongqing, Nanjing, Hangzhou, like these second tier cities are becoming far more vibrant. And part of that, by the way, is what happened to Wuhan. You know, when all those people are surging into the city. Yeah. Remember, China has moved from 15% urban to I think 56% urban.
Oh, wow.
And remember, every 10% is about 140 million people in China.
Right.
So this massive wave from the countryside to the city center, and that is a very high density melting pot of populations. One that also can leave at sort of the drop of the hat. So before quarantine hit in Wuhan officially, 5 million people had already left the city.
Wow. So it's going to come up, and this is a good segue, but the COVID-19 thing. So you just missed that you're a virus refugee. What's happening in China? I'm sure you're talking to a lot of people, and it's sort of especially with young people. Like, what's going on now?
So it's this weird moment now, and I'm sure when this comes out, it'll be a little bit of a different moment. But right now, we're at this there's been a sea change this last week. I'll give you an example. About 3 weeks ago, I had put together around 1,000 masks, high quality masks, the N95s that I was trying to send to friends throughout China. I sent them to one friend who helped me distribute them. And he sent out about 700 of them before things started to kind of get a little bit better in China. It's not, by the way, it's not particularly relaxed in Wuhan right now, but everywhere else, a lot of the heavy quarantining, a lot of the staying at home that was being enforced pretty rigorously, people are going back to work. And so a few days ago, I wake up to a text from a very close friend of mine. This was not him poking fun at me. He was like, "Hey man, I'm watching the news. Things seem to be getting better here, and I'm looking what's going on in New York. Do you want me to send the masks back?"
Yes.
And I'm thinking like, wow, 3 weeks ago, it was looking like the end of days in China. And then the stranglehold that they put on their cities, that they put on their economy. I mean, the amount of small businesses that have gone up, that have evaporated. And they were just like, look, it's that or the spreads. It's already spread dramatically, but it's beginning to slow down in China, just as the rest of us around the world. We're of course, there's a lot of panic around China. There's a lot of criticism for how China handled things, as well as some praise. And we have to now evaluate how good we'll be at facing a similar crisis, of course, with much more information than China had at the outset.
Wow. And I suppose that's one of the benefits of an authoritarian form of government, for lack of a better term. But, there's always that thing about a benevolent dictator, where we're going to do the best for the people, no matter what it takes. And I'm just going to say it. And, there's not going to be a Congress to pass it, and half the Congress doesn't like it, and half the Congress. It's just going to happen. And they sort of did that with COVID-19, right?
Absolutely. So I've said you've seen the best of the Chinese government and the worst of the Chinese government. The worst came first. The worst was the suppression of information, particularly with Dr. Lee, who passed from viral load, and that they did not want that information to get out. It was seen as embarrassing. It was seen, they wanted to clean up the mess before it spilled across the country, and then as we've seen across the world. And that, in my decade of being in and around China, I have not seen a greater stress test of the relationship between young people and the government, far more than Hong Kong, by the way.
Really? Wow.
Since when that happened.
Right.
So that's the worst of it. But the best of it is, when they decide to make a decision, they can shut down cities. When they decide to, they could stop the spread of this thing. They could decide the rails just aren't going to be turned on. They could build a hospital in 10 days.
Right.
The ability to be nimble, exactly what you're saying. Like, you can learn a lot about a government by the way it responds to crisis. And we learned that there are some upsides and some downsides of it. We actually basically just saw on display the upsides and downsides of a semi-authoritarian regime.
Huh.
And we're likely to see the upsides and downsides of each government system across the world as it responds to it, ours included.
Well, the Italians just did the same thing the Chinese did.
Yeah, and there's some historical precedent. It is pretty interesting. Like, so you can learn a lot about a government by the way it responds to this crisis. You could also learn a lot about a country by the diseases it gets, right?
Yeah.
In China, there's a lot of conversation about China's already a fully developed country. China is the source of most of the retail growth in the world right now. Actually, in the luxury space, China is going to be responsible for 2/3 of all growth in the luxury space between now and 2025, according to McKinsey. So we think of China, and they're the biggest travel spenders in the world by a lot.
Yeah. They're
also growing far faster than any other market. So when you think about the consumer revolution in China and what we're seeing and the numbers we're seeing, you think of the Shanghai skyline, you think of modern, you think of big, but Wuhan has reminded us that a lot of places in China are still developing. They get that sort of disease is one that could only happen in a developing country. In the United States, we sort of have wealthy people diseases. We have diabetes, we have obesity, we have an opioid addiction. Those are luxurious ailments when you compare one to the other. You can learn a lot about where a country's at in its development based on the sort of illnesses and diseases it procures. And this is a great reminder that there's a lot of China that's still poor and still developing.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing about the Wuhan crisis was that when I would talk to people, that everybody was amazed that there was a 11 million person city that nobody had ever heard of. And we're like, that's as big as New York, man.
And hey, y'all should go to Chongqing. Like, if you really want to have your mind blown, I always say Chongqing, which is relatively close to Wuhan, is the most optically stimulating place I've never been to India, so people always say that when you go to India maybe you'll change your mind, but Chongqing it's like 5 Hong Kongs. It's a mountain city. It's an enormous population. It's developed at an incredible pace. So you'll be in the subway, sort of in the side of this mountain in a tunnel. It's not dark because you're on the subway, but then suddenly you'll burst out of the side of this mountain and you'll be 200 meters over this enormous skyline that's just burst out of the earth over the last 5 years. I mean, it really, there's no place like it. And for those of you trying to diversify your China travel, once China travel resumes, Chongqing should be at the top of all your lists.
Now, along those same lines, sort of a dark side of this whole thing too. I just read a piece in the New York Times about a form of like racism coming from the virus fears. Random attacks on Chinese people, or people that they just think are Chinese.
Right.
Have you seen that at all, or what's your take on that type of thing?
All over. I've seen it all over, and it's unfortunate. The high level is, we'd like to say that, okay, it's not just China. If it came from Mexico, if it came from Russia, we'd be doing the same thing. I don't buy that. And I've talked with a number of folks who spend a lot of time in China, spend a lot of time in Asia. There's a discomfort with China, specifically China.
Huh.
that we do not have with other countries and cultures. And when the economy is booming, and when trade is enriching both sides, and when we focus on the opportunity, we kind of overlook that. By the way, I encounter this almost every day in my work.
Hmm.
And then, of course, as soon as this happens, that again, going back to that cultural and linguistic distance, that different style of government, the different sense, like, the different understandings of beauty, the different understandings of communication, all of that discomfort, I think, manifested. And you're seeing this in the travel industry. You're seeing this in retail. You're seeing this just on the street. I'm in New York. I was walking through Chinatown the other day, and you hear people saying, "Oh, like on the street, we shouldn't walk through Chinatown because we might get coronavirus."
Yeah.
And it's just this was even a couple months ago when there was no cases in the United States. It just the number of Asians, and of course Asian Americans, East Asian Americans, who have told me that they have encountered this in the last couple of weeks. It reflects a greater discomfort, a greater ill ease.
Yeah.
With I think Eastern cultures in general, different than Japan. So Japan, I think, everyone wants to go to Japan. The amount of people who have told me they're canceling Japan trips the last couple of weeks, I'm like, wow, I didn't realize everyone I knew was planning on going to Japan in the next few months. Japan is also really linguistically and culturally distant, but it's distant in ways that we love.
Right.
We think of Japanese culture, oh, they're too clean. The food is too delicate, like they're too polite. Like they're right. There are the aspects of those bits of culture that we love, and they're like the almost a hyperbolic version of that. China, I think, is sort of the opposite. There's this element of entropy. There's an element of it being the wild, wild west. There's different mediums of there's different definitions of what it means to be polite. They have not westernized. Japan was exposed to the United States from a very through war.
Right.
And has been a developed economy since the 1980s. For China, modernization has not necessarily meant westernization. And that concept, that idea that as a country grows more modern, they don't want to be more like us, I think has caused a huge amount of friction in the workspace, in the media space, and then of course just in the personal realm of people dealing with Chinese and Chinese Americans.
Well, my man, there is no question to me right now why you get a lot of public speaking gigs. I think that's an epiphany for me, and I think it's correct. And a lot of things like that come from your own feelings, whether you like them or not, but from people you talk to and how you understand, culture in both countries, or in a lot of different countries. You go to Scandinavia, there's none of that about any of us from Europe or any European person, but with Chinese, there's definitely something different about it, and I think it's because of just sort of the rapid development. And your point, and we can't get to a lot of this, but I would again encourage everybody to listen to Zak's TED Talk. 400 plus million Chinese, what we would call millennials, and to your point,
right.
they divide that a little bit different. And we think we've got a lot, and we've got 75, 80 million. So you're talking about 5 times as many young people that grew up with a culture and a society that is totally different just within the last 20 years. I mean,
massive.
Yeah.
This question of what, so I try to start with this in some of the talks I get to do. And it's this why should you care question.
Right.
Because there's a lot of things that are interesting. There's a lot of phenomena that are fascinating. But you don't have to care about all of them, particularly if it's not your particular, intellectual inclination, like whatever. Like if you don't like that thing, then you don't have to care about it.
Right.
You can't not care about China.
Right.
And particularly this young generation. There's 417 million millennials. There's more young people in China than there are people in the United States and Canada combined. They're coming of age at a time where China is rising into economic relevance, geopolitical relevance. They're becoming the world's biggest spenders. They're becoming the world's biggest consumers, the world's biggest manufacturers, increasingly the world's biggest innovators, and will be our direct competition in that. And this isn't some distant idea. So it's not just if you're interested in global real estate markets, it's okay, who's buying up the property next to me in Columbus, Ohio? It's not, am I interested in the international film industry? It's, okay, why is it that when I bring, my cousin Timmy to go see a movie, suddenly Shanghai has to be as prominently featured as New York? There are aspects of this young generation, what they want, how they see the world, what they want for themselves, their family, their country, that are going to be impacting our lives directly. And that's because of just the amount of sheer impact that they're going to be able to have on the world.
Do you think it's correct? I mean, you said the 20th century was the American century. Is this the Chinese century?
So it's hard for me to say that. So what I see is, when I think of the way this century will play out, and by the way, I try to be more conservative and do it in 50-year. All the way that history has sped up and sort of telescoped, things move so fast that who knows. But what it's looking like to me now is we're looking at an East-West century. For the last 500, 600 years, really since the age of exploration in the 1500s, really around the 1500s, much of culture, much of the way that modernization, industrialization has worked, has been pretty Western-centric.
Sure.
Particularly since World War II. We think about the way that the world operates today. We think about a lot of the global governing bodies. We think about the global language of English. That sort of happened in the last little stretch. And so, if you look at the top spenders in the world and who marketers and retailers have had to be savvy about, the top 5 has been Western European, American. That's been it. And so, even as the tiger economies, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Thailand, as they were emerging, they didn't have quite the economic and political clout that China has. Mm-hmm. And so they kind of fell into our orbit of cultural gravity. What's so fascinating about China is, because of their numbers, because of their economic and political clout, suddenly they have enough, what I do think of as cultural gravity, that they might start to be able to shift the way that our world spins. So this is the first Eastern culture, and this is the first Eastern generation, I'm using Eastern very broadly, that has the potential to impact and even direct global culture at a size and scale that frankly we just haven't seen in the last handful of centuries. Tracking that, understanding that, trying to see how that all fits together, and then of course predicting it as best as we can.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a wild set of questions to consider, and frankly relatively unprecedented, certainly since the Industrial Revolution.
So, have you considered becoming an ambassador to China?
I've definitely not. It seems like a terrible job.
Economic advisor to China?
It just also not. For me, I don't, and I know I have friends who work in government. I get to interact with some folks who, I do some work in government, but for me, and I know this sounds a little bit, for me, it doesn't, a lot of the opportunities for cooperation, for better understanding, I don't have a lot of faith that our governments, either government, is going to produce those. And so for me, the private sector, as weird as that sounds, there's like a sort of, I truly believe the more enmeshed, this is actually capitalism at work, right? The more our incentives are aligned to understand one another, the more we feel like we need to understand the other, and the more that our economies, our businesses are enmeshed, I think the better our chance is of having a real strong bridge between China and the United States, between China and the world, between East and West. And so working to understand that a little bit better, I run a market insights firm, and I still do a good amount of writing and speaking. So it is understanding at its core, but I'm not there trying to change policy and fight that fight in Congress. I unfortunately don't have I think millennials in the United States, a lot of us have seen the faults of our system more than its sort of glories, if you will, or the real benefits. We see a lot of the bureaucracy and things getting stuck, and so I'm doing my best to avoid it a little bit at the moment.
I can understand that even on a smaller scale. When we used to go to China, if we really wanted something done, we would talk to Lee and Fung. Because we were doing business with Lee and Fung, so we'd talk to them like, hey, we need some Range Rovers. And they'd be like, all right, we're going to do that. And we need to get across that border over there. We need to go to that city. It's like, oh, okay, we'll get that done. So there was, like my son said, like almost a mafia sense of the businesses really being in a lot more control or having control over a lot of things that it would have been difficult for us to do otherwise. So I think that them meshing, like an American business and a Chinese business meshing together, I think is probably the most positive outcome that we could think of going forward.
And just wildly beneficial to both sides.
Yeah.
Like when you think about why people are like, oh, why is trade important? Why? I mean, there are so many opportunities, where our strengths are China's weaknesses, where China's strengths are our weaknesses. And so when you can sidestep some of the political entanglements to really hone in on those, suddenly the zero-sum game of politics, I win, you lose.
Right.
That's sort of the only way it works. Suddenly you feel like you can become detached from that really finite, narrow way of looking at the game.
Well, when we were talking about,
like there could be win-wins.
Yeah, we were talking about these trade wars, and I know from doing a lot of business in China, it isn't like that. I mean, when you have a partner in business, somebody is making something for you, or you're helping them make things, and you're giving them what to make, and certainly they do business with other people as well. I mean, it's a partnership. You can't say, I don't need the goods, so screw you, I'm going to get them somewhere else. I mean, it just doesn't work like that. And they need you, you need them. And I think, whatever issues you have, it's easier to work out when you have that kind of partnership, when you rely on each other for one thing or another, than it is to say, to your points, and some game, we're going to go to war, which is like absurd at the end of the day.
Mutual reliance, it's but that's how great relationships are formed. Yeah, do you want to get along? And absolutely. But once you rely on one another, the incentives to get along are the stakes are raised. Yeah. And we've seen that just trying to play nice and be friends, that doesn't quite work. So working together, I trust, will be far better incentivized to find a way. And by the way, you're already seeing it. If some of these trade war issues, as they're getting resolved, and by the way, some of the trade war issues are absolute necessities. Equal market access. It was a sooner or later issue. I'm from Berkeley and I went to school in New York. You could guess my politics. But a lot of what's happening in this trade war, the issues around IP protection and equal market access in particular, like those were it was a sooner or later issue, and it should have frankly happened sooner in the last administration.
Right.
With that being said, there's so much economic productivity, not just in like the finance capitals, but you look at the number of states whose farmers ship most of their product to China. You look at the number of states whose products are, they have specific relationships with cities and provinces throughout China that many of us had never heard of. The level of economic productivity that can sort of be unleashed, an opportunity that can be really dispersed throughout America and not just in these, banking centers. To me, it's a real wonderful opportunity.
Yeah, and I agree. So I'm gonna bring you down a little bit here and have some fun. I mean, you're obviously like extremely well versed on the topic. I feel like I could talk to you for about 3 days, but we'll do that sometime, maybe. You're a super busy person, so what do you do for fun? You haven't really talked about what you do for fun yet.
Yeah, so I've had this sort of dark realization the last year or two since the book came out that I've not had a lot of time off. Like last year, I was about 8 months on the road. 5 continents. This year it was looking to be something similar. And so honestly, what I love to do for fun is actually to travel. Do it, doing it for business versus doing it for fun is a different deal. So, but when I have been able to tack some days on some of these trips, particularly in cool places, that same curiosity that drove me to want to understand China better. I feel that way when I go to Egypt, a place that we spend a lot of time on the government, not a lot of time on the people.
Right.
I've spent some more time in the Middle East, North Africa in general, and I've loved that. I was in France the other day, and I sometimes talk some junk about European travel, because to me, I'm like, oh, it's very indulgent. And then I went, and I was like, wow.
Yeah.
Like, oh, wow.
I hear you.
Okay, right. This is why people loved it. So for me, the ability to interact with other cultures, and culture, I feel like has become a wishy-washy word, but for me, what's interesting is seeing different ways that people live. When I like to travel, I think of it as sort of like browsing lives, different ways that a life can be led. And it's not just, China is where I've sort of hunkered down, but whenever I get the opportunity to travel around the world, I do that. And I had an Airbnb host in France who was wonderful. They're incredible, and they were teachers, and they were an older couple. And the best line I heard from them was they were saying, they used to travel a lot, but now that we're Airbnb hosts, we get to travel all over the world without leaving our homes, because they have wonderful international guests, and they also read a lot. So the second thing I would say is I love to read. I still love to read, and it's a lot of what drove my passion to write a book, because it sure as heck was not writing that I loved. I will tell you that.
Yeah. I've tried a little of that myself, and it's difficult. You want to correct everything. You read a paragraph again, and you're like, that's totally wrong.
Yeah, I think Hemingway said writing's easy. You just wake up every morning and open a vein. It's a tough craft. But even though we're certainly moving away from that in terms of content, I still think there's a place for sort of long form storytelling, hopefully.
I hear you. Ditto. I hear you about the travel too, because I just kind of within the last 10 years, I spent, 20, 30 years just traveling, just working. Like I think I went to Paris 30 times and never went to the Louvre, which is, it's awful. Yeah. Just recently I had a chance to go to Norway, which I don't know if you've ever been there, but they're a fantastic country. And I decided I was going to stay an extra day and go to the Viking Ship Museum.
Cool.
I know. And it was amazing. These people would get on these boats and sail on the ocean, and basically rowboats, like 1,000 miles. And you look at these ships that are, from 800. And it's pretty fascinating. I'm sure you found the same thing in China, where some of the history is just ancient and more amazing than anything in America. Like we're looking at 200 years old. You go, wow, that thing's ancient. When you look at a boat that people used to sail 1,000 miles and that's 1,500 years old, it really kind of freaks you out. One more thing.
Honestly, the world is a totally fascinating place, and I know everyone. There's a lot of ways to travel. In particular, I kind of rail against this. I do some work in the travel industry. And so when I see people just traveling for Instagram pictures, I get a little bit sad. Which by the way is totally legit. And any way that forces you out, I would encourage, like, being able to understand the history of a place. Even just being back in France, and I was in Normandy, and that's recent history. And it's been a very long time since I've engaged with any of that. So I'm like, wow, I should take the opportunity to sort of dust off that. But by the way, I watched a YouTube video instead of reading a full book, and got the spark notes. But that is being able to dive into these different places, and the amount of it. Like, this is a great area where the internet is actually wonderful. Yeah. And you really do have so much information at your fingertips that could really enrich the travel process.
Well, it's great. I mean, I use my phone to book the flights. I use my phone to talk to the people I'm talking to. I use to find a good restaurant, to see how far it was to where I was speaking, to the Viking Ship Museum, and to to get a cab or to get a car. And, everything.
Google Maps. What did people do before Google Maps?
I know.
Impossible to tell.
I know. I traveled.
They didn't leave home.
I traveled all over China. We talk about it and we say, like, how did we do that? And we would send orders back to the U.S. in fax.
I was talking. I have a friend. I have a very close friend from college who I was speaking to the other day. We drove across the country from my folks' place in California to his folks' place in Long Island, and this was before GPS. And I remember when we were starting, we were just like, do we print out a MapQuest thing? Like, is that for the entire country? Is that what?
You
Is
got to
that what
buy an
we do?
atlas, man.
Yeah, well, I mean, we did ultimately we figured out how to read a map, but it was like actually a puzzling, an issue that will never exist again.
Right. Yeah. So technology is the bomb in many ways. Anything else you want to add before we go to the lightning round? Anything that you're up to that you want to talk about?
Yeah, the one thing I would add is that amongst all of this, amongst what's going on in Wuhan in China with the coronavirus and what's happening here, I would encourage everyone to think about the people instead of the governments. What do I mean by that? A lot of my friends in China, when they were watching the way international media was responding, they didn't feel like they were getting a lot of support. So if your house was sick, would you like people talking about how the local government mismanaged your house? Or would you like people to be asking, hey, how's your family? How are you feeling? Are you scared? The composite of 1.4 billion people essentially being under house arrest for weeks and weeks on end, the layers of fear and paranoia, and also just cabin fever of just being stuck with your parents and relatives. I mean, that adds up. And a lot of my friends in China used a Chengdu, a Chinese idiom, to describe the way they felt, and it was 落井下石. It means to throw rocks at the man who fell in the well.
Wow.
And China felt beat up. It felt unsupported at a moment where they really were looking for support. So just in any situation, it's easy to talk about, big brother Chinese government. That's fine. And do it. But also keep in mind that there's people there too. And they hurt the way we hurt, and they're happy the way we're happy. And just being empathetic towards that is something that, as these global crises continue to unfold, as they will, think about the people, not just the governments and the headlines.
Really, really well put. And, thank you very much. I think any of us sitting even in this room needed to hear that. That's really well put, especially since, we're sort of on the cusp of it, I think, to an extent. And, we've got sort of a divided country here, but we're at the end of the day, we're all the same. I mean, we're people, we have families, et cetera. So really well put. I'm going to ask you a couple of things. We call it a lightning round, and I just need you to tell me the first thing that comes to your mind. Are you set?
Let's do it.
Okay. Global warming.
Oof, tragedy of the commons.
Yeah, I think it's true. And, there's been back and forth about that too, right? Between the two countries.
Yeah.
And I think.
Yep. One of the interesting things of coronavirus is that there was about 8 weeks where a lot of factories were shut down, and there's no doubt that the air around these major manufacturing hubs in China cleared up. And it was an interesting wake-up call for a lot of people in China to see those maps.
Yeah, I bet. And deniers, it's like I've traveled a lot, and you get up in a plane, you get up to 8 miles high, and you can see the curve of the earth, and you're thinking, this is kind of a small place, and you're and you're blowing a bunch of smoke in the sky. I mean, anyway.
Yeah. The other thing I'd say that comes to mind, and I've been thinking about this book a lot with what's going on with coronavirus, is The Earth Abides. It's a science fiction book, and it's about something different, but this idea of, the world will get hotter, the world will get colder, the Earth will be fine. The people inhabiting that 2 meters of crust, it's on us to figure it out. The Earth abides.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. Talk about a sad thing. I don't know. I think we're getting a little lesson here now with this COVID-19, which is really good. And maybe we'll all come together a little bit more across the globe. One last thing. You are addicted to.
Oh, so I thought you were going to tell me the answer to that. I'm like, wow, what did you read?
I think I could take a guess at what you're addicted to.
Take it on. Hit me with it. What do you think I'm addicted to?
I think you're addicted to perception. I think you have like an excellent perception of the way that people feel, the way that people think, the things that are important. whether it's global warming or whether it's Wuhan or, Chinese language or whatever we've discussed today. I think that your perception of these things is what really kind of drives you. And to define your perception, I think is part of your personality. So if I had to guess, that would be my guess.
Thank you. That is extraordinarily high praise. On my best days, that's what I try to be addicted to. And just for fun, to bring in the humanity a little bit. The thing I'm also addicted to is Chinese daytime TV. I watch an embarrassing, especially with all the travel and all the planes. I watch so much Chinese music shows, and I can tell you more about Chinese rock and Chinese rap than anyone really should be able to do. So it's true.
Okay, Zak, you've been super gracious, and thanks for the enlightening conversation, and much appreciated. Thanks for making WDcast a whole hell of a lot better. Thanks, Zak.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks to all of your listeners.
Okay, people, be sure and listen anytime for some more human interaction on hot topics, which, by the way, you're welcome to suggest. Also, be sure and subscribe to this podcast. WDcast is at WDpartners.com. Go to the menu hamburger and hit what we think. Then go to the very bottom of that page in the center and hit the podcast icon and peruse at will. We've got a lot of great interviews in there, including Google, Lionesque, EY, Donato's, which is a local thing, Green Growth Brands, Whole Foods, and now Zak Dychtwald. And thanks for listening. As you all probably know, you can't make the shot if you don't take it. So, okay, take care and stay frosty out there, my friends. Thank you.
Check it out.